I thought buying an abandoned mountain house would be simple. No neighbors, no HOA meetings, no drama. Just silence, trees, and a fresh start. But when I finally returned, keys in hand, renovation plans ready, I didn't find dust or broken windows. I found lights on, curtains drawn, and a family sitting inside my house, living like they belonged there. They weren't panicking, they weren't hiding. They looked confident, almost prepared. And when I asked who gave them the right to be there, the answer I got made my stomach drop. Because this wasn't just trespassing, this was power, authority, and a neighborhood that had already decided I was the problem. So how does a home you legally own become someone else's property overnight? And what happens when you refuse to walk away? Before everything unraveled, my life around that mountain house was quiet in the best possible way. I wasn't looking for luxury or status when I bought it. I was looking for distance. Distance from noise, from crowds, from the constant feeling of being watched or judged. The listing had called it an abandoned mountain property, untouched for years, tucked away at the edge of a winding road where cell service faded and pine trees crowded the sky. Most people saw problems. I saw freedom. The house itself wasn't impressive at first glance. Weathered wood, a sagging porch, windows clouded by dust and time. But the land was solid, the deed was clean, and the price reflected the work it needed. I did my homework. Title search, county records, everything pointed to the same conclusion. The property was legally mine and had been sitting unused for years. I didn't move in right away. Life didn't allow for that. The plan was simple: secure the property, lock it up, and come back months later with time and savings to renovate it properly. A slow restoration, new roof, reinforced foundation, a place that would eventually feel like home. For a while, that plan worked. Every few months, I'd drive up the mountain just to check on things. The road up was narrow and quiet, lined with mailboxes that looked more symbolic than functional. The houses were spread out, some well-maintained, others half-hidden by trees. It felt less like a neighborhood and more like a loose collection of people who preferred to not be bothered. That should have been my first clue. There was an HOA, technically, I knew that much. It was mentioned in the paperwork, almost as an afterthought. Minimal dues, basic rules, nothing that raised alarms. I wasn't planning to build anything outrageous or disrupt anyone's peace. I assumed it would never matter. During those early visits, no one spoke to me. No welcoming wave, no questions. Just curtains shifting slightly when I drove past, the subtle awareness of being noticed without being acknowledged. It was odd, but I brushed it off. Mountain communities value privacy, or so I told myself. Time passed. Work kept me away longer than expected. Months turned into over a year. The house remained locked, untouched, exactly as I'd left it. Or so I believed. When I finally cleared my schedule to start renovations, I felt a sense of relief pulling into the gravel driveway. This was the reset I'd been waiting for, a chance to build something with my own hands, away from interference. But even before I reached the front door, something felt wrong. The yard looked used, tire tracks that weren't mine, trash bins near the side of the house that I had never purchased. The porch light, which I distinctly remembered disconnecting, was intact, clean, functional. I told myself not to overreact. Maybe a neighbor had been keeping an eye on things. Maybe the HOA had done some maintenance in my absence. It wasn't unheard of. Still, the unease settled in my chest and refused to move. What I didn't know yet was that during my absence, my house hadn't been treated like an abandoned structure. It had been treated like an opportunity. The HOA, which I had barely thought about, had been very busy. Neighbors who had never spoken to me had been talking about me, about the empty house, about how long it had been since anyone saw the owner, about what they believed should happen to a property that wasn't being actively used. And somewhere along the way, those conversations crossed a line. By the time I returned for good, the story of my house had already been rewritten by people who didn't own it, people who believed proximity gave them authority, people who convinced themselves that silence meant consent. I hadn't broken any rules yet. I hadn't missed a payment. I hadn't been warned or notified of anything serious. On paper, everything was still mine. But in reality, the neighborhood had already made a decision, and I was about to find out how far they were willing to go.
The moment I stepped inside the house, the illusion of a simple misunderstanding shattered. This wasn't a break-in or a temporary shelter situation. The place had been settled, furniture arranged, personal belongings stacked neatly against walls I still hadn't repaired. The smell of cooked food lingered in the air. Someone had been living a full, comfortable life inside a property I legally owned, and they hadn't rushed to hide it. Within hours, the situation escalated beyond confusion and into something far more disturbing. The HOA appeared almost immediately, not with concern, but with confidence. Notices began showing up before I could even process what I'd walked into. Violation warnings, complaints, accusations. According to them, I was the problem. The empty house I'd purchased and locked had apparently become a community issue during my absence, an eyesore, a liability, a violation of neighborhood standards. I was told the property had been managed in my absence, that the HOA had acted in the best interest of the community, that people had moved in to protect the home, that it was temporary, that it was justified. And then came the fines. Daily penalties for neglect, retroactive charges for alleged violations I'd never been informed about, maintenance fees for work I'd never approved. Suddenly, my mailbox was filling with certified letters detailing thousands of dollars in supposed debts, all tied to decisions made without my consent. Every attempt to push back made things worse. The HOA rules, which had once seemed harmless, revealed sharp edges. Clauses about abandoned properties, language vague enough to be weaponized, policies that gave the board sweeping authority if a homeowner was deemed non-responsive or inactive. According to their records, I fit that category perfectly. I hadn't vanished, I hadn't defaulted, I hadn't broken the law. But none of that mattered once the narrative had shifted. Neighbors who had never spoken to me suddenly had opinions. Complaints appeared on record about noise, safety concerns, even accusations that my presence now made them uncomfortable. The irony was suffocating. I was being treated like an intruder in my own home. The family living inside the house didn't act like squatters. They acted protected. Every time I tried to assert ownership, the pressure intensified. More warnings, more deadlines, more threats of legal action for disrupting community harmony. What terrified me wasn't just the audacity, it was how coordinated it all felt. The HOA wasn't reacting, they were executing a plan that had clearly started long before I arrived. Requests for documentation were ignored or delayed. Meetings were postponed. When responses came, they were filled with legal language designed to intimidate rather than clarify. I was told to be patient, to work within the system, to respect the board's authority. Meanwhile, the clock kept ticking. Each week brought new consequences. Late fees stacked onto fines. Liens were mentioned casually, like a warning shot rather than a last resort. The suggestion that the HOA could take control of the property if I didn't comply wasn't even framed as a threat, it was framed as policy. I started realizing how vulnerable the situation really was. Ownership on paper meant nothing if the people controlling enforcement decided otherwise, if they labeled you a problem, if they convinced enough neighbors that you didn't belong. The mountain house that once symbolized peace now felt like a trap. But the worst part wasn't the money or the stress. It was the realization that this wasn't just about rules. It was about entitlement. Someone in that HOA believed proximity gave them power. Someone believed absence meant forfeiture. Someone believed they could rewrite reality if they buried it under enough paperwork and pressure. And as the fines grew and the warnings turned more aggressive, it became clear that the next step wouldn't be another letter. It would be a confrontation, one that would force me to either surrender my home or finally expose how far the HOA had gone behind my back. And the moment I decided not to back down, everything changed. The breaking point came faster than I expected, and louder. It wasn't another letter or fine. It was a notice taped directly to my front door. Bright paper, bold text, official seals. According to the HOA, I was now in violation for unlawful occupation and disturbance. They claimed the family living inside had been authorized under an emergency community provision, and if I interfered again, the HOA would pursue legal action against me. Standing there, staring at that notice on my own door, something snapped. This wasn't incompetence, this wasn't confusion, this was a deliberate takeover. I demanded a formal hearing. They didn't expect that. The HOA scheduled it quickly, too quickly. A special session, they called it, held in the community lodge at the center of the mountain neighborhood. When I arrived, the room was already full. Board members seated up front, neighbors lining the walls. The same neighbors who had avoided eye contact for years were suddenly watching closely, like this was entertainment. The HOA president ran the meeting with confidence bordering on arrogance. He spoke calmly about community standards, abandoned properties, and the burden my house had placed on the neighborhood. He talked about safety, about responsibility, about how the board had been forced to act when I failed to maintain active presence. Then he said it. He claimed the HOA had the authority to place occupants in my home to preserve property value. The room went quiet. I felt every eye shift toward me, waiting for my reaction. This was the moment they expected me to break, to argue emotionally, to look unreasonable, to confirm the story they'd been telling behind my back. Instead, I did the one thing they hadn't planned for. I let him finish. Then I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I laid out facts, dates, documents, county filings, proof of ownership, proof of paid dues, proof that the house was never abandoned, never delinquent, never subject to emergency seizure under state law. And then I revealed the part that changed everything. The family living inside my home hadn't been placed there under any legal provision. There was no emergency order, no municipal authorization, no lawful transfer of access. What the HOA president had done, what he had signed off on, was a private arrangement, one that bypassed the board's own bylaws, one that gave occupancy rights to people with personal connections to him. The room shifted. Whispers spread. Board members began flipping through documents they clearly hadn't seen before. The confidence on the president's face cracked for the first time. I explained what his authority actually amounted to under state law: trespass, fraud, abuse of fiduciary duty. And then I dropped the final bomb. While the HOA had been busy fining and threatening me, I had filed a formal complaint with the county, complete with evidence of unauthorized occupancy, falsified HOA records, and misuse of emergency provisions. The complaint didn't just name the HOA, it named him personally. That was the moment the meeting spiraled out of control. Neighbors started asking questions the board couldn't answer. Other homeowners demanded explanations. The narrative the HOA had carefully constructed collapsed in real time. The president tried to regain control, but his authority was gone. The room no longer saw a protector of community standards. They saw someone who had crossed a line. The final blow came when one board member, someone who had clearly been kept in the dark, stood up and asked whether the HOA's insurance covered intentional misconduct. No one answered. The meeting ended abruptly. No vote, no resolution, just panic disguised as procedure. As I walked out, I realized something important. This was no longer about my house. It was about accountability. And for the first time since I'd returned to the mountain, the power had shifted. The HOA knew it.
The neighbors knew it, and the people living inside my home were about to find out exactly how fragile their protection really was. The fallout didn't come all at once. It came quietly, then all at once. Within days of that meeting, the tone of every message from the HOA changed. The threats disappeared, the fines stopped accumulating, the language shifted from authority to caution, from demands to requests. The board suddenly wanted to clarify misunderstandings and reset communication. The same people who once spoke with certainty now chose every word carefully. The family living inside my house moved out without confrontation. No arguments, no goodbyes. One morning, the lights were off, the driveway was empty, the door was locked the way I had left it the year before. Whatever assurances they'd been given had evaporated the moment legal scrutiny entered the picture. The official explanation from the HOA was brief and carefully worded. They claimed an internal review had found procedural errors. No admission of wrongdoing, no apology, but the outcome spoke louder than any statement. All fines were withdrawn, every notice was voided, the lien threat vanished like it had never existed. Then came the consequences they couldn't quietly undo. The HOA president resigned within a month, not because he admitted fault, but because staying would have required answering questions he couldn't control. The board announced new policies, new oversight measures, and mandatory legal training. None of that would have happened if the system hadn't been exposed under pressure. Neighbors started speaking to me differently after that. Some apologized indirectly with awkward conversations that danced around responsibility. Others avoided me entirely. The mounting felt quieter again, but not in the comforting way it once had. The illusion of unity had cracked, and people were suddenly aware of how fragile authority could be when questioned. I finished renovating the house, slowly and deliberately. Each improvement felt symbolic. New locks, new doors, stronger foundations, not just to protect the structure, but to reclaim what had almost been taken through paperwork and intimidation rather than force. The experience changed how I viewed ownership. It taught me that property isn't just about deeds and boundaries, it's about vigilance, about understanding how easily systems designed for order can be twisted into tools of control when left unchecked. What struck me most wasn't how aggressive the HOA became, but how comfortable they were doing it, how quickly a narrative can form when someone isn't present to challenge it, how easily silence gets mistaken for surrender. The house is mine now in every sense of the word, not because I fought harder, but because I refused to disappear when it mattered most. I asked questions, I demanded records, I forced transparency where none existed before. And that's the real takeaway. Power thrives on compliance, not legality. The moment you question it, document it, and bring it into the light, it weakens. Whether it's an HOA, a board, or any authority that operates without accountability, the rules only work when people believe they have no choice. I had a choice. I took it. So if you ever find yourself being told to accept something that doesn't feel right, especially when you know the truth is on your side, don't assume the system is unbeatable. Sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to step back for everything to change.